Fear comes in a variety of forms, and few things are less comfortable than living in a state of fear. The anxiety, the tension, it seems more than we can bear. Fear isolates us, chases us down, boxes us in. Fear leaves us feeling like there's no escape, reaching out for us with unseen hands. Ominous clouds gather, and darkness settles over our soul. But where does fear come from? And why does it hold power over us? How do we learn, despite the gathered darkness, that there is nothing to fear? How do we face the night and await the coming dawn? In life's most terrifying moments, we hear the voice of the Savior say, "Fear not."
I want you to imagine for a moment that that feeling you had as a child when you woke up in the middle of the night with a scary dream. And so you make your way into your parents' bedroom and you wake them up in your fear. And they assure you that everything will be all right. It's okay. It's just a dream. Daddy's here. Mommy's here. You're fine. Everything is going to be fine. Just go on back to sleep. Now, imagine as you drift back off to sleep, you find yourself right back in the midst of the nightmare. Only subconsciously, you know that your mom and dad are there. You were just talking to them, right? Like they were just interacting. They just assured you it's going to be okay. But now, all of a sudden, that three-eyed, sharp-fanged, hairy beast that's chasing you through the graveyard is back. And this feeling washes over you that they've told you it's going to be okay. But suddenly it doesn't seem like it. They've assured you that everything is fine. But now the person you're relying on to keep you safe isn't keeping you safe. And the fear becomes something more. Because now, not only are you terrified of the three-eyed, sharp-fanged, hairy, slobbering beast chasing you through the graveyard, you're also kind of afraid that your folks aren't able to protect you. That maybe they don't care. Because you know they're there, but they're not doing anything to alleviate your fear. And in that moment, it doesn't matter that it's just a dream. Because in that moment, your perception is reality, and you are trapped in this vivid dream that feels so much like the waking world, you can't really tell the difference. So far, as we've made our way through this conversation, we've talked about where fear comes from. That essentially fear is what happens when there is a break in our relationship with God. That the fear that we should have toward God, the reverential awe of who He is, begins to spill over into other things, and we become afraid because our relationship with a holy God has been broken. But we've also seen how because of the death and resurrection of Jesus, when we allow what He does on the cross to count for us personally, that we are made right with God. We're brought back into a right relationship with God. And so, as a result, we can live without fear. So what happens when you're scared? And God doesn't seem to be helping. Right? Because the reality is, even in a world where you've been brought into a right relationship with God through the death and resurrection of Jesus. You've let what he's done on the cross count for you. You know in the depths of your soul you are saved from your sin, that you are in right relationship with God, yet something is terrifying you, and he doesn't seem to be all that concerned about helping you. What do you do now when you feel scared and you feel hopeless? Let's take a look into Mark chapter 4. Because there's a moment where the disciples found themselves very much in a similar set of circumstances. They were terrified, they were hopeless, they were scared. And Jesus, it seems, wasn't all that concerned. We're going to begin reading together in Mark chapter 4, starting in verse 35. We'll have it for you on the screen here. Open a Bible, click on a device. Follow along with us in the app on YouVersion. Verse 35 of Mark chapter 4 begins like this. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him, and a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care that we drown?" And he got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." And then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And they were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." When we come into this moment in Mark's gospel, Jesus has spent the day teaching the crowds. And Mark tells us that when evening came, he looks at his disciples and says, "Let's go over to the other side of the lake." Now, Mark doesn't tell us what his agenda is or his intent is once he gets there. They're going to be crossing over the Sea of Galilee and entering into Jewish territory. So perhaps Jesus is just looking for a respite from the crowds that have been following him throughout Judea, and he thinks maybe if he goes where they won't follow, he'll get some rest. Spoiler alert, he won't. He's going to be met by a man possessed by a legion of demons when he gets across the lake, and if Jesus was intending to get away and find some quiet time to just relax, he wasn't going to find it there. We don't know exactly what Jesus' intent was. Perhaps he had scheduled his own appointment with that demon-possessed man and knew, I need to get across the lake because there's someone there who needs my help. We don't know. What we are told, though, is that as they're making their way across the Sea of Galilee, a tremendous storm comes upon the water. Mark describes it almost like a swirling tornado is the scene that he's depicting. The winds are swirling crazily. The waves are crashing. And there's a couple of things we have to remember at this point. First off, that it was not uncommon for storms to suddenly arise on the Sea of Galilee. It's just part of the weather patterns of that portion of the world, particularly on that body of water. It was not uncommon for that to happen. The other thing we have to remember in this is that at least some of Jesus' disciples are fishermen, meaning they have spent much of their adult life on this lake. Right? They have been in these waters plenty of times. And yet something happens here that terrifies them. Mark describes the scene for us with the winds crashing and the winds howling, the waves are crashing. And he says the water begins to get inside the boat. Now, I don't know if you know much about boats. I'm not a boat person. But I do know enough to know that if you're in a boat, you want the water outside the boat, right? Because when the water that's outside the boat gets in the boat, it starts to get a little dicey, right? So the water begins to flood over the side of the boat. Now, there's a picture we want to put up here that hopefully will help us. In 1986, the waters of the Sea of Galilee kind of receded during a dry season, And archaeologists were able to recover the remains of a fishing boat that dates roughly to the New Testament era, perhaps a little before, perhaps a little bit after. But it gives us a bit of insight into the type of fishing boats that Jewish folks were using on the Sea of Galilee. There's, as you can see, not a lot of it left. The boat measures 27 feet long, approximately 8 feet wide, but only 4 feet tall. So the sides are pretty low when you get in the water. When you put the expected crew of 12 to 15 fishermen in this boat, you can imagine it's going to sink and ride pretty low in the water. And so these boats were lightweight, which is why they were used, but that made them susceptible to high waves and taking on water, which again, if you're in a fishing boat, you want the water outside the boat, not inside. And so, the disciples, as they had done many times, find themselves in the midst of a storm on the Sea of Galilee, taking on water. Now, no doubt they had heard countless tales throughout the years, perhaps even had acquaintances they knew who had gone out onto the lake, been caught in a similar squall, and met their watery fate at the bottom of the sea. They know the danger that is present in this moment. And despite spending much of their adult lives on this very lake, this is a kind of storm that catches even them off guard. This is the kind of storm that lets them know this is bad. This isn't just something we're going to ride out and weather. And so, in their terrified state, they go to rouse Jesus, who Mark tells us is in the stern of the boat, sleeping on a cushion. Now, for me, I always kind of wonder about this, because in my mind's eye, I always just kind of picture like Jesus is like somewhere undercover, right? Because how else does he sleep? But when you look at the picture of the boat we had up there, there's not like a little cabin or anything in it. He's just like snoozing on the deck of this boat in the midst of the storm. And in their terror, they go to rouse Jesus. And what does Mark tell us? They ask him, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to die?" Interestingly, the way Mark recounts the story, Jesus doesn't respond in words. He doesn't answer their question, at least not directly. He just stands up, rebukes the wind and the waves with a word: "Peace, be stilled." Now, some have been quick to point out that these storms that come up quickly on the Sea of Galilee sometimes dissipate just as quickly. And so perhaps all that's happening here is the weather patterns shifted again. But the way Mark tells the story, that's really not an option available to us. The disciples did not in any way mistake this for a normal weather phenomenon that they had experienced time and time again, when the storm comes and then suddenly the storm goes. In this moment, they knew this was different. They knew something had happened here that was out of the ordinary. And we know because of what their response is that we'll come to in a few moments. In all of their experience on the Sea of Galilee, they knew this wasn't simply a matter of coincidence of timing, that Jesus just happened to say, "Peace, be still," at the moment the storm was about to stop. They understood in this moment that the storm stopped because Jesus spoke. Earlier in Mark's gospel, he's used similar language to describe the words and actions of Jesus. And in those scenes, when Jesus is rebuking something, in the first parts of Mark's gospel, often it's an evil spirit possessing someone that Jesus rebukes and casts out of them. Here in Mark chapter 4, this is the first of several miracles that are going to unfold between now and Mark chapter 8. In quick succession, Mark begins telling these isolated incidents, these moments in the life of Jesus, in the ministry of Jesus, where he begins to show and demonstrate his power, not simply over evil spirits, but over sickness, over disease, here over the very patterns of weather that plague the world. And it all climaxes in Mark chapter 8, when Jesus demonstrates his power over death itself and raises a little girl from the dead. And the disciples recognize in this moment something different is happening. They come to Jesus, they rouse him from his sleep, and they say, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown?" So in their minds, in this moment, one of two things is possible. Either they believe that Jesus is helpless to do anything to rescue them, or he must be uninterested in doing so. And given the fact that they go and wake Jesus up, kind of rules out the first possibility. They're expecting him to do something, right? That's why they go and wake him up. It's not that they believe Jesus can't help them. They have seen enough, even by this early stage in Mark's gospel, to know that when the storm comes, go get Jesus. When things go south, go get Jesus. So it's not that they expect that he can't do anything. In fact, just the opposite. They believe that Jesus could rescue them. But he's back there asleep. So maybe he doesn't care. We know he could do something. We know he has the power to do something. But he's not doing anything. So they come to him and they say, "Master, don't you care if we die?" They expect him to help. They know when times get tough, just go get Jesus. But he's with them. And he doesn't seem all that interested in helping. And we think, well, if he's not helping, then he must not care. And I think if we're honest, when we find ourselves in those moments where life seems to be falling apart, where the winds are howling and the waves are crashing and everything seems to go backwards, where it seems like nothing is right, when it seems like things are falling apart, sometimes we can get to this moment and we're like, I know Jesus is there, and I know he can help, but he sure isn't. And in those moments, that's when fear comes and whispers in your ear. If he can help, and he really cared, he would help. And so if he's not helping, he must not care. And now suddenly we're the child in the middle of the night, thrust back into a nightmare after mom and dad have said, "It's going to be okay, we're here." Well, you're supposed to be keeping me safe, and all of a sudden that three-eyed, hairy, drooling beast is chasing me through the graveyard again. And if you can't do anything about it, or worse, you won't do anything about it, what hope can I have? So they wake Jesus up, expecting him to do something. But the voice, the question that they voice is, okay, Jesus, we know what you can do. You're not doing it. So do you care? Is this it? Now, there's another aspect to this. There's another side to this story, right? We've kind of been drilling into the disciples' perspective here a little bit. And I think this is just like the Exodus. This is one of those stories that if you have been around the church, you kind of have heard this story probably oftentimes, and so we sometimes know it well enough. It's a very short story. There's not a lot for us to miss. But sometimes we know it so well, we just kind of read right past it. Yeah, Jesus calms the storm. But in the midst of this, at the height of the storm, Jesus is resting peaceably. Good. Not because he's out of the weather. Not because somehow he's not experiencing this with them. But at the height of the storm, Jesus, we're told, is in the stern of the boat, sleeping on a cushion. Why is that? What distinguishes Jesus' perspective from theirs? I think perhaps it has something to do with what he says at the beginning of this scene. He says, when evening comes, let us go over to the other side. Can I let y'all in on the secret? If Jesus says you're going to the other side, you're going to go to the other side. If Jesus says, come on, we're going to go across the lake, it doesn't matter what happens in the middle of the lake. You're going to go to the other side of the lake. There's not a storm that can thwart that. But fear often grips us when the wind is howling and the waves are crashing and the boat is filling up with water. All of a sudden we feel like, man, I'm just not going to make it. This is it. This is the end. And it's easy for us, I think, to relate to understand the disciples' perspective in these moments. But the perspective that will bring us help and bring us hope is the perspective of Jesus, who says, we're going to go across the lake. Gets us to the big idea we want to wrestle through today. That when you are assured of Jesus' presence with you and his plans for you, don't let fear cause you to doubt his concern for you. When you are assured of Jesus' presence with you and his plans for you, don't let fear cause you to doubt his concern for you. Now, let's be clear. Sometimes in life, we end up in the middle of a storm that has nothing to do with Jesus taking us anywhere. Like, can we acknowledge that? Sometimes we decide we're going to go off on our own and we're in the middle of a storm and we're like, how did we get here? And Jesus is like, well, I went this way. And you said, no, I'm going to go this way. And you end up in the middle of a storm. Those aren't the moments we're talking about. This is a moment where Jesus says, come, let us go to the other side of the lake. And the disciples go, okay, Jesus, we're with you. We're going to go where you lead. We're going to do what you say. And sometimes going where Jesus leads, doing what Jesus says, puts you in the middle of a storm. And it can be really easy in those moments to begin to be afraid and to be scared. The disciples here are terrified. They think this is the end. There is no way out. They are scared. They are helpless. And Jesus doesn't seem to care. But when you are assured of Jesus' presence with you and of his plans for you, don't let fear cause you to doubt his concern for you. Jesus stands up and simply speaks, and the storm stops. And then he turns to the disciples. He says, why are you so afraid? Do you not have any faith? I told you We were going to the other side of the lake. Now, throughout the Old Testament, there is this motif of humanity at the mercy of the powers of the world. Throughout the Old Testament, quite poetically, there is this depiction that humanity has no power over the natural forces, which shouldn't surprise us because we live in the same world they did and we have no control over the natural forces, right? It's just a thing that's beyond our control. But throughout the Old Testament, there's also another motif that depicts God as the one who sends the rain or withholds the rain, the one who commands the thunderbolts. And one of those moments in the Old Testament, you can almost hear echoing in the wind of Mark's description of this storm. It's in Psalm 107, starting in verse 23. It says, "Others went out on the sea in ships. They were merchants on the mighty waters, and they saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. For he spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. In peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered like drunken men. They were at their wits' end. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for men. Let them exalt him in the assembly of the people and praise him in the council of the elders." Jesus says, "Don't you know who I am? Do you have no faith? Why are you afraid? Don't you know what's happening here?" And the disciples respond with another question. Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? And given everything that has unfolded in the story of Scripture up to this point, there is only one available answer. Because there is only one who calls the wind and the waves to heed. But they ask this question, who is this? Who could this be? And Mark is going to spend the rest of his gospel answering that very question. He's going to answer it as the miracles unfold and Jesus demonstrates his power over evil spirits, as Jesus demonstrates his power over sickness and disease, as he demonstrates his power over death itself, first in raising a little girl, and ultimately by the end of the story, being raised from the dead himself. Mark's going to spend a lot of time with this question, just who is this man? But the definitive answer that Mark gives us comes from a place we might not expect. It comes in a moment as Jesus is hanging on the cross. And he cries out in a loud voice and he dies. Standing at the foot of the cross is a Roman centurion. He says, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." See, when you're assured of Jesus' presence with you and his plans for you, don't let fear cause you to doubt his concern for you. Because sometimes the plans that God has to do what God is going to accomplish don't look like what we might expect them to. Sometimes they put the people of God in the midst of a storm. It put Jesus himself on the cross. And so sometimes we find ourselves in these moments where we feel like life is crashing down, things aren't going as we want, and we cry out, we say, God, don't you care? And he's like, no, I'm accomplishing my plans and my purposes, and this storm is just part of that. This is going to help you better understand who I am. And as Mark concludes this scene on the Sea of Galilee, he tells us now the disciples are scared again. In fact, quite literally what Mark tells us is that they feared a great fear. Because who could this be? That even the wind and the waves obey him. And they begin this moment scared in their worry. And they end this moment scared in their worship of the one true God who has come near, who was with them in the midst of the storm, peaceably sleeping, because he knew they were going to the other side. And once again, in this moment, we find ourselves back with that tension we've been talking about between Scripture saying, fear God and fear not. The disciples are greatly terrified. They feared a great fear when they realized whose presence they were in. And yet suddenly, the storm didn't seem so scary. Guys, when you are assured that God is with you, you're assured of his presence, you know his plans for you, don't let fear come and cause you to doubt that he is concerned for you. Now, let's be honest, that does not make the storm any less real. It does not make the storm any less threatening, does not make the storm any less scary. But here's what it does. It lets you know beyond all doubt who is in control. Invite the band to come back. Sometimes we find ourselves in these moments when we can't help but be afraid. Storms of life come, everything crashes down. We're in a boat that feels like it is filling up with water. And we know that God could do something. We know that Jesus could do something. But he doesn't seem to be doing anything. And so we start to question, Lord, do you care? Do you not get it? Do you not see what's happening? We look around at the tension of the world, at changing times and seasons of history. We look around and we see evil declared as good, good declared as evil. And it's easy to see the swirling wind and the crashing waves and to be afraid. But the one who calls the storm to heed is with us. And the one who calls the storm to heed is for us. And the one who calls the storm to heed has said we're going to the other side. So there is nothing left in the storm to fear. Would you pray with me?